So years ago, long before I was the pastor of a church, I spent several years as a volunteer church youth group leader. And whether you help lead a big youth group or a small youth group, one of the things that you are certainly going to wind up doing is planning retreats. That is like a weekend or even a week-long getaway where you go somewhere far away, you do different things with different people, and you spend time pursuing God. And by the way, there's retreats for other things too. There's all church retreats, there's corporate retreats, and really the reason why you would spend so much time, energy, planning, and money on such a short period of time in your year is actually relatively simple. You see, it's actually very difficult to get people to change the essential practices and rhythms of their life, actually whether they want to change them or not, while they are still in the throes of their normal rhythms. And so when you go on a retreat, you go to a different place, you unplug from your typical rhythms, your typical obligations, maybe even your typical social circle for two purposes. One of them is to just step back for a second and reevaluate the big picture of your life. And if it's a church retreat or a youth group retreat for church, then you're reevaluating specifically the spiritual end of your life. But the other reason why you do it is to step away and to reevaluate the typical rhythms of life that you have and maybe decide if certain things need to be rechanged and reoriented towards the Lord. And it's a very effective thing to do. As a matter of fact, I think if you ask most current or former youth group students at most churches, what's the most formative thing that you've experienced about being part of a youth group? One thing they'll say is the relationships, but the other thing that people will frequently cite is retreats. And I certainly had that kind of an experience. Now, here's why I bring that up right now. Right now, one of the things that all the lockdowns have done is to rob us of a sense of normalcy. And a lot of us are craving that. But one way to look at it is that lack of rhythm, that break from our typical rhythm, actually allows us the opportunity to reevaluate, to step back and look at the big picture of our life and some of the smaller patterns and ask if maybe things, especially things spiritually with God, might need to be a little bit different and to maybe head another direction. And so, look, there's two ways that we can go back to, quote, normal over the next several weeks. One is to not think about it at all and to simply go back to as close as we can to the way things were. And if the way things were with our walk with God was especially phenomenal and everything else in life was great, then maybe that's a good plan. But on the other hand, I suspect that what God is doing in a lot of us right now is providing us the space to have somewhat of a retreat, to step back, to reevaluate things, and to be very intentional about the rhythms that we reestablish in our lives as we kind of head back out there. Now, in the coming weeks, we're going to look at several different facets of the Christian life, and I want to invite you to take a big look at where you are with Jesus and also to zoom in on several different areas and ask if maybe your rhythms could be different and better, and maybe this is an opportunity to establish new ones. But for this week, here's what I want to do. I want to orient us by first giving you one kind of clear picture of what the Christian life is supposed to be like. And then I want to talk with you about 4 reasons why Christians don't change when they set out to change their rhythms with God. And I could very well retitle that as 4 reasons seen in the book of Philippians why I haven't changed when I intended to. Because I already know a lot of people who have recommitted their life to Jesus, several at least, during this time. And I know even more who have thought of different ways that they want things with God to be different. And I don't think that any of us want to go back to that kind of normal. So what I want to do, first, a compelling picture of what it means to be a Christian, of what we're supposed to be aiming for. And this is in Philippians chapter 2. This is actually going to form basically the theme for everything we're going to be doing in the coming weeks. And this is Philippians chapter 2. Verses 14 through 16. In verse 14, the Apostle Paul says this: do everything without complaining and arguing. Now let me pause here and tell you the context. He just talked to them about obeying God and doing what God says. In other words, living the life that God intends for you to live. And he says, look, you do that without complaining to God and arguing with him. But then here's what he goes on to say what that looks like. So that you may become blameless and pure, children of God without fault, in a crooked and depraved generation, in which you shine like stars in the universe, as you hold out the word of life, in order that I may boast on the day of Christ that I did not run or labor for nothing. So first, a compelling image of the Christian life, stars. Paul picks that for a very particular reason. When I was a youth group leader, I once heard there was a speaker that I don't even remember the setting, but he did some training regarding how to do retreats and how to be a good youth group leader. And he got on the stage, and he was himself a former parole officer, and he had founded a retreat center for at-risk youth from the inner city, specifically those that had gotten into drug dealing and those who had gotten into gangs. And he would take them out into the woods, and they would all go camping with a bunch of other different leaders and go through different spiritual exercises and so on. But he said one of the things that surprised him was the way that they responded to the stars. He said more often than not, when we took students who were from the inner city, who had spent their whole lives there, when they got out into the woods, they were just about as unsettled as a country kid would be if you brought them into the inner city. It was just totally unfamiliar. But then after they set up the tents, when the clouds would part and the stars would come out, he said frequently I would see these students just staring up into the sky and laying down in awe. And he said it took me one or two times to realize that the reason that they were staring was because they had never seen this many stars before. Stars were not unfamiliar. You can see a few from the inner city, but when there's so much light coming off of the city, there's nothing to contrast the stars against. And they kind of wind up blending in. But when you get far away, the blacker the sky gets, the more so you can see these stars contrasting on the backdrop of the sky. And there's this compelling, attractive contrast between the stars and the blackness of the sky that draws your eyes upwards. Now, this is what the Apostle Paul says the Christian life is supposed to be like. That Christian life is supposed to be a compelling contrast up against the backdrop of the world in which we live. If you go naturally about the rhythms of life and the way that the world is naturally set up, it will not pull you towards looking different, and therefore it will not pull you towards looking compelling the way that Jesus wants you to. Now, Jesus himself exemplified perfectly what it looks like to live in a compelling contrast to the world around us. I mean, in some ways, he was thoroughly ordinary. I mean, he grew up in a small town. He worked a blue-collar job for most of his life. But when he started traveling in public, he was altogether different than any teacher anybody had ever seen, and in a way that people who had the ears to hear and the eyes to see found incredibly attractive. Crowds would follow him everywhere and say things to him like, "You have the words of life. You speak like someone with authority." When people went to listen to him teach, sometimes they were so wanting to be near to him that they even forgot to pack enough food, and Jesus had to make food for them, for thousands of people. And even in his daily life, as he walked, people would beg to follow him. And some of the most unlikely of people, there would be people who would be the avid partiers, who would see Jesus, who'd meet Jesus and say, "You're different than us, but you're compelling in such a way that we want you to actually come to the party." And the religious people are like, "Wait a minute, I don't get invited to the parties." And he was so compelling that even little kids wanted to crawl all over him. Now, let me tell you something. Boring people, little kids don't like crawling all over and playing with boring people, but Jesus wasn't that. Now, that leads to the 4 reasons why we Christians oftentimes fail in our efforts to form rhythms that live into that sort of compelling contrast life that's different than the rest of the world around us. And here's reason number 1, is that we don't actually see it as compelling. It is true that Jesus tells us, he said, "Look, the world hated you, and world hated me, and so it will hate you." And it's true that Christianity is not going to be well loved, and we as Christians shouldn't expect to be well loved by everybody. But to those with eyes and ears to hear, there's actually something compelling about the Christian life. And oftentimes we don't change because we don't actually see or think that that's true. And yet, when Jesus called his first disciples to himself, that was the first promise that he made to them. Remember when Jesus first calls Peter, and Peter is a fisherman on a boat, working a really ordinary job. Jesus doesn't lead off by telling him, I'm going to save you from your sins, I'm God. Maybe Peter has heard that he's made those claims. But the first promise that Jesus makes is, come with me and I will make you fishers of men. In other words, I will lead you into such a compelling place that people actually want to follow you, that people with eyes to see and ears to hear will want what you have. And the more they follow Jesus, the more true they must have realized that because Jesus himself had what the world so desperately needed but couldn't seem to find on its own, that when Jesus said, come with me and I'll make you fishers of men, you're my disciples, you'll be like me, that what he's really promising is the same way that I am different than the world and I am compelling, I'm going to make you that way too. Now, here's my problem. Growing up as like a good Christian kid, I was a pastor's kid and very proper. A lot of the things that we tell people to do, a lot of the things that we tell people to do in the Christian life, we're kind of conditioned to think that a lot of those things are either dorky or kind of just make you a little bit of a pathetic mama's boy. Things like if you're going to be humble, things like if you're going to be forgiving, or you're going to exercise self-control, or you're going to wait till you're married, or you're going to stay off drugs. And what we can oftentimes think of the Christian life as is that it's an obligation. And yes, it's a contrast from the world, but it's not a compelling one. That we're invited to look like Ned Flanders, but we forget that we're being invited to look like the very same guy that gathered crowds of 5,000 that people could not help but follow. So that's the first thing that you need to realize, is every time Jesus calls us into something, we have to realize that if properly lived out, it doesn't look pathetic. It winds up with those with eyes to see being incredibly attractive and compelling, and it's nothing to actually be ashamed of. It's something to let shine like the stars in the universe. That's with a compelling contrast. Here's the second reason, though, why at least I find I often fail to change. The second thing that I see here in the book of Philippians, and that's that Christians, we don't expect it to be a fight. One of the things that we pastors do, and Christians in general do when we talk about forgiveness, is we use the language of, when you become a Christian, Jesus will change you. And that is 100% true. That's absolutely the case. But when we only put it that way, what it makes it sound like is that the role of a Christian is passive. And at first, when you become a Christian, there's so much passion, there's so much heart change and excitement that in the beginning, the change that Jesus brings on is effortless. But we make it sound to you as though that's going to be the rule, and that at all times, it is always just going to feel natural, like you're being pulled forward, and that it's not going to look like a fight. Now, in Philippians, the Apostle Paul is writing actually to a military town. Decades earlier, there was an army that fought a great battle for the empire. And so in part as a reward, and in part because I think that Caesar was a little bit scared of having an army and some motivated generals that large on the doorstep of Rome in case they might have a coup, he gave them the city of Philippi. And so the city of Philippi was military veterans and soldiers, first, second, and even third generation soldiers from these families. It was a core area of recruitment for the Roman army. And therefore, military experience was something that every single soldier and every single family was very familiar with and respectful of. And so that's the language Paul uses. I read through the book of Philippians, and I actually highlighted every area I could find that was a military language reference that Jesus used, or that Paul uses for them to connect with. And there are at least, conservatively counting, in 3 pages of this book, there are 27 different references to military pictures. Now, in these military references, every time the mission of exhibiting Jesus Christ or living the Christian life is referenced, there's the repeated reference to these 2 phrases that go right past us, but a military family would have known exactly what that meant. The phrase, stand firm, and the phrase, press ahead. Let me explain what I mean. I'm going to need a whiteboard. Let me get that in just a minute. So you guys don't know this, but I hide cookies right off screen right there. Last week it was Thin Mints. Delicious. Oh, no. So every military family, when they hear military language like victory and fighting, and in the midst of it they hear stand firm and press forward, it would be an unmistakable image of what it is that Paul meant the Christian life was going to feel like. You see, at war, the Roman legion, among their many other tactics, they did something that we call deploying it the phalanx. And what that meant is that if you were going to fight against the Roman army and you were on the front line, this is what you would see. You would see all of these different shields lined up and the men behind them. And now the idea was that as these shields were all locked together and there's men standing behind them, that as you approached, there was no way to get around a shield to stab or to get under. And so when the Romans lined up this way, they were fully protected. And what you do is as the enemy army charged, you would lock your shields together and they would run up against the shields and you'd be fully protected until, as one, everybody would push at once and they'd stab forward with their shields, bring the phalanx back down and advance. Now, here's what this is saying. If you're going to live in compelling contrast to the world, it is going to feel like pressing forward. And oftentimes when you didn't expect for there to actually be opposition, namely when you didn't expect to be battling your own habits in the flesh, when you didn't expect to be battling the disapproval of the world around you, or the spiritual temptations that seem to come out of nowhere, then failure is a surprise. And setbacks are a surprise, and they're so demoralizing that you tend to sit back and wait and say, I'm going to wait till this doesn't feel like a fight anymore, because the spiritual walk isn't supposed to feel like a fight. It's just supposed to feel like being swept along. Now, here's the third reason why it is that Christians often fail when they try to change in a godly direction. You know what it is? I think this is the one that gets more Westerners than any of the other ones. We try to do it alone. There's a survey I read concerning pastors. It's actually pretty old. It's pretty out of date. It's from over 15 years ago. But they surveyed pastors in the United States across all denominations. And here's what they found. It was shocking at the time. That of all pastors that started out in ministry being senior pastors, that is leading churches, the 5-year attrition rate, that is the number who quit the ministry entirely within the first 5 years, was 50%. The 20-year attrition rate was 90%. And among the most often cited reasons why pastors said they quit the ministry was spiritual burnout. Now this is because, frankly, we're hypocrites. See, here's what we like to think. We like to think, look, all of you need church. You need church, otherwise you're not going to grow. You can't do this alone. But me, the pastor, the one leading you, the one feeding you, the one pouring into everybody else's life, I'm different. I have found a way to do it just me and Jesus, and I'm going to grow, and I'm going to be okay. And most of the time, that pastor doesn't make it in the long term, or they look hollow in their job. Now look if pastors are citing spiritual burnout most of the time because they're trying to do their spiritual life alone. Somebody with that kind of education, that kind of motivation, set out with such high hopes to make a difference in the world, do you really think it's any different for you? This verse in Philippians chapter 1, verse 27, same thing again, but I'm going to give you a different emphasis. Paul writes, "Stand firm in one spirit, contending as one man for the faith." What does it mean to talk to a group of people and say contend as one man? It's back to the same image again of all of these shields together in the phalanx. When all of these shields interlocked in battle, you couldn't penetrate and flank any individual man because all of the shields formed one continuous protection all the way across. And if they broke ranks and they just ran headlong into the enemy, that advantage is entirely mitigated. Likewise, if one or two of these men break ranks, it leaves the ones next to them exposed. On the other hand, if they keep their shields locked, the shield of the man next to you actually it lends strength for when somebody pushes on yours, or when somebody pushes on his, it gets transferred over. And so it's one big piece of support. Now, doing this was fighting, quote, as one. One of the things you'd yell when it was time to lift your sword and stab is either as one man or as one. And when the people in this military town heard that you need to contend for the faith, all of you, as one man, they know exactly what it means when you're standing firm and you're doing that. It's this picture right here. Here's what God is saying to you in Philippians, and frankly, this is the message of the whole Bible. One of the reasons why you and I don't change is we have a misunderstanding of how God works. You see, God saves us individually, but he immediately connects us with family. And I think you could state it this strongly, that if you want a religion where God has a private relationship with you and no one else is involved, and that's going to transform you throughout your whole life into what he intends for you to be with no other person being used, I think you'd say you're going to have to find another God, because that's not how he works. You and I, whether we're attempting to forgive or working on a marriage, or whether we're trying to break a private sinful habit, if we are trying to do that alone and we're not doing that in community, people who we can actually fight alongside of, not just be with, but are in the fight with us, we can't expect to make that much progress. And finally, last reason number 4, why it is that Christians often fail to change, fail to attain the compelling contrast that Jesus has for us. And this is most simple, but also one of the easiest to ignore, is that we don't look to Jesus himself. Now, on the face of it, this looks as though I'm kind of contradicting myself, because early on I said that look, one of the reasons we fail is that we think it's going to be effortless. We don't expect that it's going to be a fight. And you say, of course, right? I mean, of course it's going to take work to change. But on the other end of that pendulum, what you can wind up doing is saying, it's so much up to me to change, that you stop looking to Jesus for the power to do it. You can think of it this way. Spiritual maturity, you could place, say, on a line, right? So let's say -10, this is as far as you could possibly get away from God, right? You're not a Christian, you hate God, you're far from, you're so far from God that you basically snag your devil horns on your pillow every time you go to bed at night. In the middle, you could say 0. This is the spot where you cross over from being an unbeliever to a believer, to where you go from being skeptical to following Jesus, from trying to make your own way to accepting grace. This is the spot of conversion. Now over here, you could say it over here, this is +10. +10 is like full Christian maturity. Nobody in this life attains this. I mean, at this point, you're routinely mistaken for Jesus Christ himself. That's what it is. And in between are all these other numbers that we have to travel through as we grow. Now, here's one of the ways that people see the work of Jesus Christ on the cross as the gospel. That the gospel of Jesus Christ is useful right here. It gets you from -1 to +1. And that what you rely on Jesus for is merely to get saved. Now, Jesus absolutely does that, but what we oftentimes forget is that the gospel of Jesus Christ, the grace of Jesus Christ, and our relationship with the person of Jesus Christ isn't just the thing that gets us over the line, but Jesus Christ himself is the fuel for the journey. In Philippians chapter 1, at the very beginning, I'm looking at verse 6. The Apostle Paul, when he's talking about how confident he is about the change that God is making in the life of the Philippians, in addition to calling it a battle, he says this, being confident of this, that he who began a good work in you will carry it on to completion until the day of Christ Jesus. So he's saying, look, it's not only that you're going to be in this fight, but God himself is ultimately the one who has won the war, and he's going to give you the energy. And this can be so confusing, but let me just put it this way. In the book of Hebrews, this is described even more vividly. It says, let us fix our eyes on Jesus, the author and perfecter of our faith. Now, that word perfecter, it's hard to translate it. In Greek, it's the word archegos. It's actually a military term. It's the word champion. Another archegos in Greek literature would be somebody like Achilles or Hercules. It's the person in the army who's the strongest, who defeats the enemy, that when you're discouraged, you look to them to know how the fight is going. Now, when we talk about keeping our eyes on Jesus, all of us are pressing forward. All of us are in a fight. And let's suppose that you were in a battle one day and you weren't sure how it was going. The person that you're going to look to is the strongest person in the army. Why? You look to them for encouragement. And if they're steaming ahead and if they're winning, you've got someone to follow and you've got some assurance that things are going well. But if they're falling back and they're losing, what chance do you have? Now, Jesus, as the perfecter of our faith, the archegos, the captain, the champion, he has defeated our enemies of sin, Satan, and death. He did live the compelling life. He was perfect. And not only does he fight with us, but he's already won the war. And so when your eyes are fixed on him, when you're looking at his grace, his mercy, his majesty, it's not that it stops feeling like a fight, but all of the energy, the courage, the encouragement, all of that can come from Jesus Christ to push you further, to fight further than you ever could have on your own. And here's what I want to tell you. This sermon series we're going into it's about many things. It's about addressing habits, but it's also about finding how Jesus Christ gives you the strength and the power to actually change and become like him. And that's the promise that he makes to you when he calls you a disciple. Not just that he'll improve you a little bit, but that you can actually start to look just like him, the author and perfecter of your faith. So I want to encourage you to come along with us in the coming weeks. We're going to re-examine different areas of life where maybe in the past you've tried to change and you've tried to be different and it felt like you either failed in one way or another or you fell backwards. I want to encourage you to treat this time that we're in right now as a retreat, as a place to bring your life before God, to renew your hope in the kind of power that he has to change you in really compelling ways, so that you and I won't emerge from this time the same way as when we went in, that we might look more like Jesus Christ, having the things that the world longs for but doesn't seem to know where to find it. Let's pray.